Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Green Mile, starring Tom Hanks, David Morse, Bonnie Hunt, Michael Clark Duncan, James Cromwell, Michael Jeter, Doug Hutchinson, and Sam Rockwell, and directed by Frank Darabont. Now, before I get into this review, I have seen it a few times. I think my first time was on HBO when I was very young. And I remember my mother being concerned about some scenes in the movie, but I'll point them out when we get into the review. For now, let's just get into it. The movie opens with an elderly Paul Edgecombe at a retirement center who likes to walk. Then, next scene, Paul with his friend Elaine, as well as other residents, watch the TV and an old movie with Fred Astaire dancing on the song Heaven brings Paul back a memory as he gets emotional and walks out of the room with Elaine as he tells the story of when he was a prison guard during the Depression as he was in charge of death row. And we move back to 1935 at the Louisiana State Prison where we see Paul as a younger man and played by Tom Hanks as he suffers from an urinary infection, which means he has a hard time taking a leak on the toilet. We meet some other guards like Brutal Howell, played by David Morse, Dean Stanton, played by Barry Pepper, Harry Terwilliger, and Percy Wetmore, played by Doug Hutchinson, whom I reviewed before as Looney Bin Jim in Punisher Warzone, as they bring in a new inmate as the convict's name is John Coffey, played by Michael Clark Duncan, and just like the drink, but spelled differently. Who I really enjoyed him in every movie I saw him in, and I do miss him as an actor. And I'm liking these characters except for Percy because the actor is an unlikable presence. Doug Hutchinson, I mean. And as we see him at the beginning of the movie, he hits an inmate named Eduardo Del Delacroix, played by Michael Jeter, in the hand and breaks his fingers, but the performances by Tom Hanks, Barry Pepper, and Michael Clark Duncan are amazing. Why exactly is John in prison? Well, he took two little girls and killed them in an open field, crying uncontrollably while holding them in his arms, but didn't mean to as he wanted to take it back, but it was too late, which is a very sad but it's a powerful performance by Michael Clark Duncan, in my opinion. Paul meets Warden Hal Moores, played by James Cromwell, whom I've enjoyed in other movies and very much here, as he gives Paul the execution papers of an inmate named Arlen Bitterbuck, and they talk about why Percy is guarding in the first place. And it's revealed because he's a nephew of the governor's wife, and his political connections are what got him hired in the first place, as he's stupid and mean to the prisoners. And this movie is very well shot, as it's also very well made, but not quite as well as The Shawshank Redemption. Paul is married to Jan, played by Bonnie Hunt, whom I reviewed quite a few times in voiceovers, plus Jumanji with Robin Williams. And I like her here despite she has very little to do. The next day, Brutus spots a mouse in the cell block as he with Paul watch it run into a small room in the corner, which is a padded room for dangerous inmates, but is under storage, which was kind of funny. But the funniest part is, a few hours later, Percy spots the mouse as he arrives and goes into fury trying to kill it. And honestly, why would you want to kill a mouse? Because I think it's pretty cute for a pet. Hell, even better than rats, in my opinion. But it was hilarious as Percy is a fucking idiot when wants to smash it to death, as he's a careless character, and Stephen King does do a good job with portraying him like an evil, like Clancy Brown's character in The Shawshank Redemption. And yes, this is another Stephen King novel or short story. I forget which one it is. Why is this movie called The Green Mile? Well, because the prison where they're located at has a mile of green on the inside, which is an interestingly good title for this movie, and in the prison as well. While Bitterbuck is granted one final meeting with his family, Paul and the other group's guards, prepare the auditorium with an electric chair for his upcoming execution, which did worry my mother when I first saw this movie because she didn't want me to see a death on the electric chair. And to be fair, I was pretty damn young when I first saw this on HBO. So I can relate to that, but the electric chair death is a realistic thing back in the day. But I'm unsure if prisons do that anymore, so the movie pulls those scenes off pretty damn good. The next day, Dell has found the mouse and names it Mr. Jingles as it learns some tricks, and I like that scene as it was enjoyable until Percy comes in and has uncharacteristic and he's uncharacteristically supportive of it as he suggests they get a cigar box. Not cigarettes, but cigars to sleep in, as it sounds like he wants to smash it to death, which he'll do later, as I don't want this character around and I want him to shut up at this point, as he was getting on my nerves every time he was on screen. Paul meets Warden Hal about a new inmate coming in who killed 3 people in a holdup, and every time we meet with Warden Hal, he talks about his wife, which will be a necessary thing to get to later in the movie. At night, Paul suffers from an urinary infection, or his urinary infection, I'll say, even more as he is in constant pain, which is believable acting by Tom Hanks, as the next day he tends to meet with the doctor. Percy and Harry bring in a William Wild Bill Wharton, and Wild Bill is played by an absolute wonderful actor, Sam Rockwell, as he gets in the Green Mile and he goes insane by beating up and strangling the guards, including Paul, and as he gets Dean, Percy stands there as I thought, what the fuck are you doing, Percy? Just get him. Isn't that what you were trying to do the whole fucking film? Finally, Brutus comes in and takes Warden out and puts him in the cell, and as soon as the others leave, he collapses in pain as John wants to speak with Paul, and with great effort, Paul approaches John's cell as John grabs Paul in the groin and holds for several seconds until the light flares brightly as John lets go and releases a cloud of gnat-like spores from his mouth that disappear in the air, which was rather weird with the spores coming out of his mouth, and it fixes Paul's infection as he can urinate like a normal person again without feeling any pain, which was briefly bizarre. Paul comes home and feels reborn and makes love with Jan almost all night long, and I do love Sam Rockwell in his role, but curing the urination infection was rather an odd moment, but I still like the fact that he cures it. Do I feel 100% about how that happened? Not really. But I'll give this movie that little moment. Paul presents John with a loaf of cornbread baked by his wife as thanks for John's help, and he shares the cornbread with Dell and Mr. Jingles, but doesn't give any to Wild Bill, who is blatantly a racist, as it enrages Wild Bill, who takes his fury out on the guards over the next few days and urinates on Harry, spits chocolate all over Brutus, and so the guards use a fire hose to catch Wild Bill off guard and puts him in a straitjacket and sends him to the padded room as it becomes his frequent residence for a while. And I love Rockwell in this role as he's a crazy motherfucker. Dell's execution is never coming nearer, and the guards are having a talk with him about it as his concern is what will happen to Mr. Jingles. Brutus suggests sending him off to a magical place called Mouseville in Florida. But first, they feel that Dell should do a show with Mr. Jingles for the prison staff, and I like that scene. It works well as Percy steps on Mr. Jingles, like I predicted, as he runs across the room between cells and he's coldly uncaring. Then John asks for the mouse so he can cure it, and he does, and the guards watch in shock in shock, awe, and possibly horror, as light shines and with his hands as he brings it back alive. Paul confronts Percy with another guard and gives him an ultimatum in which he'll transfer out immediately after Dell's execution, or else the other guards will go public about Percy's record of mistreatment of the prisoners and his inadequate behavior on the mile, as he agrees on the night of Dell's execution. Just before he walks the mile to the electric chair, Dell gives Mr. Jingles to John, I meant to say. Well, to Paul, I'll say that first. Knowing that he will be taken care of which is sweet of Paul. When Paul points out that he cannot have a mouse sitting in his shoulder during an execution, John volunteers to take care of Mr. Jingles, and Dells asks for forgiveness for his crimes and asks Paul not to forget about Mouseville, as Percy deviously responds that Mouseville isn't real, as the men mention it to keep him quiet, which upsets both Dell and the guards, which is very sad to bring up, because Dell is a relatable character with his mouse. Percy proceeds by hooking Dell to the electrodes with one small exception. He purposely does not suck the sponge he places on Dell's head, eating to push Dell one more time as Paul notices that the sponge is dry, but just too late. The electricity has been activated. As a result, the execution is excruciating for Dell as he convulses and screams and in pain. Much to the increasing horror of the audience, which did feel typical Stephen King, and at the same time, John is hysterically crying as he seems to telepathically feel Dell's struggle as he dies, and Warden Hell is upset about it, as well as I would be. As it's over, Percy claims he didn't know that the sponge needed to be wet, which I'm calling bullshit at this point, as how can a guard not know to wet the goddamn sponge while on execution? And again, I get the impression he did that shit on purpose. Because of the mouse thing. Paul, Jan, Hal, and his wife are on the next day, invite the guards over to dinner, just not Percy, as they're discussing John's acts of healing both Paul and Mr. Jingles. And Paul thinks John is an innocent man, which is a good shot scene and is well acted by these actors. The next day, they get a plan going as Paul brings out some drinks, excuse me, and offers one that is drugged to Wild Bill, which puts him to sleep as they gag Percy and put him in a straitjacket and place him in the padded room for a few hours, and supposedly as retribution for what he did to Dell. But in reality, so that he will not see them leaving, Dean has memorized a cover story in case that someone comes overland, that is, John went crazy and attacked the guards, so they put him in the padded room, while the rest is at the medical facility, which is rather clever. They get John out as he's excited to go outside and helps Melinda, who's Hal's wife, and as they're on the way out, while Bill grabs John's arm and he's horrified by what he sees by touching Wild Bill, who finally falls asleep, which is a clever plan. They arrive at Hal's house as he threatens them with a shotgun, thinking there is a prison riot or escape attempt going on, and Paul carefully talks him down while John goes upstairs to meet Melinda and gets very close to her face, and something comes out of her mouthing into his, making a light in the room shine intensely, even causing a small earthquake, which is a great sequence. John breaks the connection with her falling down and coughing as Melinda sits up looking much healthier and having no memory that happened before her x-ray. Hal collapses, weeping at his wife's restoration. John continues to cough, unable to release the spores like before. Melinda gives John a what's this word? Pendant? Yeah, pendant. With the mark of St. Christopher, the healer, as a present. And that is a very powerful scene, as well acted by these actors in this scene. The men return to the prison, and John is still very ill from the encounter. Dean mentions what Wild Bill Oz almost regained in consciousness, so they quickly put John back in his cell. Percy is released from his solitary, looking aggravated. Paul tells him to take it like a man, and Percy responds that he is going to give it some serious thought. The others fear that he will talk about this one day, but that is a worry for another time. As Percy leaves, John grabs him through the bars, holds his face close to his, and releases the spores directly in Percy's mouth and lets go of him. Percy, in a daze, walks over to Wild Bill's cell. Wild Bill, just coming out to taunt him some more. Percy, a tear running across his face, empties a revolver into Wild Bill's chest. The other sees Percy, who leans back and coughs up the remaining spores, which is now getting a little bit weirder. Paul asks why he did this, as John, who's the one who made him do it, states that Wild Bill and Percy were bad men and punishes them for it. He tells Paul that he needs to see for himself and sticks out his hand over the protests of the other guards. Paul takes John's hand and immediately starts seeing the memories of Wild Bill that John is carrying. Wild Bill was a worker on the farm where the two little girls lived. One night he snuck into their room and abducted them. He threatened them that if one would scream, he would kill the other. While the electricity around them goes haywire again, Paul sees that Wild Bill was responsible for the double murder and that John was convicted for. After finally letting it go, John tells a devastated Paul that Wild Bill killed the girls with their love for each other, and it does explain a lot about it, but it just took too long to get there. It is a 3-hour movie, admittedly. Now that he knows John is innocent, Paul is unsure how to proceed this, as the next day he, with the other guards, talk with John, even asking him if they should just let him go. And John doesn't want it and doesn't want to get them in trouble. With regards to the upcoming execution, Paul asks John how he could ever justify killing an innocent man before God, as John tells him not to worry as he asks for a final request, and that is always wanting to see a flicker show, which is a motion picture. And when the camera gets close to John's face while watching the motion picture is a great shot. It truly is. It's like one of the mesmerizing shots. The day of John's execution finally arrives, as Paul doesn't want to put John in the electric chair. And I did feel bad for the character, as he was the best character throughout the movie, in my opinion. I actually cried this time, to tell you the truth. We move back to Paul as an older man, taking Elaine for a walk to the older house we went to at the beginning of the movie, where he leaves Mr. Jingles at, as Mr. Jingles is an older mouse and shows Elaine the mouse himself, and Elaine passes away and Paul goes to the funeral, and the climax is sad, but the movie with the climax is very tremendous. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 8.4 out of 10. This is a tremendous film that's well acted, well made, and very well done. I really enjoyed these characters except for Percy because he's an asshole, but the performance from Michael Clark Duncan, Tom Hanks, and even Barry Pepper, who I haven't reviewed since, Saving Private Ryan. As these are very relatable characters, despite it's not as good as The Shawshank Redemption, but it's still a tremendous film for a Stephen King film. He wrote the novel, and this is also a drama, not a horror film. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with not another Stephen King horror film, but The Majestic with Jim Carrey. I haven't seen it for a while, so we'll see how that goes. And until then, it's time to say bye-bye.